Everybody, thanks for coming to the latest installment of the Reclaim webinar series. Today we've got both Albert and I call him Mike G from OpenX to talk about DE&I marketing, multicultural marketing, privacy, opt-in, and a whole bunch of these other topics. So thanks to everybody for taking some time out of their day to join us. Just some ground rules here for those of you that are not familiar or haven't actually been to a Reclaim webinar series. We try to definitely get it in and out of here in under an hour for sure. Please feel free to kind of add any questions that you might have into the chat. Both Mike and Albert have access to the chat, so they'll either respond directly to you or they'll grab that question out of the chat and we can debate it. As I've said to both Albert and Mike, this isn't about me asking them questions. This should be interactive. So the more interaction here, the better. And last but not least, one, if you'd like some more information on any of this information, at the end of this, at the end of the webinar, both Albert and Mike will, give some information as to where you can reach out to them directly if you want to, dig into their offering or what they have. This recording will be available on our website, so you can look for that as well if you have to bounce out of here early or you get bored. So with that, maybe why don't I turn it over to you, Albert, first to introduce yourself to everybody that's here, and then you can pass the baton to Mike, and then we'll jump into it.
All right, sounds good. So Albert Thompson, Managing Director of Digital Innovation at Walton Isaacson. Been really in the space, I guess, well, it'll be a quarter of a century before I know it, but always consider myself more of a marketing technologist by trade. I think the main thing is always trying to help brands, clients, and the agencies represented understand how technology is a solve for business challenge, marketing challenges. So in a nutshell, that's me. Pleasure to be on board. Thanks for putting this together, Neil.
Yeah, and I'm Michael Guzewicz, VP of Strategic Partnerships here at OpenX. I've been in the space for about 13 years now. 2 years of that with OpenX. For those of you who aren't familiar with OpenX, we are an omni-channel global exchange, also a net zero company. And because where we sit in the programmatic ecosystem, we work with a variety of partners, whether it be agencies, brands, publishers, data companies, you name it. We're pretty much working with everyone in the space. So nice to meet everyone.
Awesome. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Neil Sweeney. I'm the founder and CEO of Reclaim. Again, if you're not familiar with Reclaim, our position in the market is really about trying to give consumers transparency and then optionality around their data downstream by allowing consumers to consent directly to their data and provide that data directly to brands and agencies. We think, we're solving a lot of challenges as it relates to consent, explicit opt-in, privacy, fidelity, so on and so forth. So, I think with that in mind, this conversation sort of specifically around multicultural and DE&I, definitely aligns with the things that are happening at OpenX, as well as some of the stuff that Albert is working on, and definitely with us. But maybe the first question I just kind of wanted to get out on the table is there's definitely been a lot of conversation around DE&I. And sometimes I think that DE&I and multicultural kind of get grouped together. It's probably important to just have everybody understand what is what and where that Venn diagram kind of starts and stops. So, Albert, do you want to take kind of your opinion as to what that definition is? And, Mike and I can riff on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when I think about DE&I in contrast or juxtaposed against multicultural, DE&I is more of a commitment. It's how you feel about culture, is inclusivity. It's a philosophy, sort of a way of. Multicultural is like what you do, it's the execution. And I think the beginning of it, the starting point is always, well, do you support the inclusivity type conversation? Or are you still in the camp where you're trying to figure that out, but you're throwing money at audiences and maybe that's capturing people of color or not? And I think the problem of it is that multicultural was very inconsistent in its commitments and investment, because the DE&I conversation didn't even exist. And then certain brands had to work their way backward and say, well, why are we so episodic in our relationship to the cultures? It's like, well, you don't have a commitment around inclusivity and all of those things and all those facets that it entails. which is why your multicultural commitment is like seasonal at best. Black History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, Pride Month, and then your ghost, which is not with the full-blown commitment to inclusivity and all the things that entails sort of means, sort of symbolizes. So the two work together, but people need to get their DE&I affairs together, and that it spans everything from supplier diversity commitments to internal change management at leadership and at the director level and down, to how you just behave, to the representation of the identity you put in the marketplace. Then it's much easier to manage, execute, segment, fund, invest multicultural marketing efforts.
Yeah, I agree with that. But for multicultural, it's almost relates to marketing, right? Whereas DE&I is putting your money where your mouth is and goes beyond just marketing. It's more about company values and what you're doing to make sure you're including everyone in the space to make sure everyone's included.
I think, that one comment you made, Albert, just around this sort of the notion of kind of seasonality around multicultural, and that maybe DE&I is a way to kind of remove that, call it that sandbox around the seasonality, and to make it an evergreen kind of always on approach. One thing that I've noticed sort of in the market is that when you talk to brands and agencies, often the dialogue around DE&I tends to be higher in the org chart.
Yes.
The multicultural tends to is getting executed, at a lower level. And I think what I find is that those two worlds aren't necessarily always talking with one another. And one of the feelings or one of the challenges that we've had is, one, we believe that, first of all, every Fortune 500 brand has a goal around DE&I. I don't know many that don't. But what I've struggled with is, how is that actually facilitating or manifesting its way down into the day-to-day of the planner, of the buyer, of the platform? And what I, not to be kind of pessimistic around it, but what I worry about is DE&I gets talked up in the trade, but does not actually manifest into action. And if it doesn't manifest into action, then it's just sort of, it's marketing speak. I don't know if you guys have seen the same, but like, how do we get that overarching goal at the agency brand level to drive down into a day-to-day execution level?
Well, it's interesting because it's a great point. I love that you brought it up. And the reason is because people are using DE&I as CSR work, corporate social responsibility. We have to put it on an identity to marketplace that we are friendly to segments. And look, that only gets you so far. I mean, but again, that's the CSR umbrella of creating laws of attraction, to be an organization that people want to deal with, work with, be a supplier with, market around, and the consumers want to buy from. Okay, but that's a feeling, that's sentiment play in the marketplace. That doesn't mean you actually have real executable, measurable commitments. And what organizations need to do is they need to decouple themselves from the fact that that's doing it by having a commitment that's under a CSR umbrella. That's similar to the notion of like greenwashing. Oh, we're environmentally friendly. Oh, we have a sustainable footprint. But until you're pumping out measures that can show up in a company's 10K report, and for those of you who don't know a 10K report, that's like the report that goes to investors in Wall Street around the financial health of your company. Does it really mean anything? Sounds good in the organization. And maybe it sounds good for press releasing, and maybe it sounds good on a blog here or there. And maybe an influencer will pick it up and say, okay, I respect that. But the reality of it is that you have to bring all your philosophies to the executional level, to the tactician level. So D&I has to go from C-level to SVP, EVP, to director level to brand managers. And that's where the conversation is falling short, because people don't understand that human nature measures you on output and execution, not on philosophical banter that makes people feel good about the narrative. And what I continuously see is that organizations haven't made the connection, because you have to bring it up as a through line. As I said on a panel, I think it was NBCU's 123, when they were talking about their commitment to small Black-owned businesses, I was like, DE&I has to be like Kung Fu. It has to be in everything you do. How you put the jacket on, how you take the jacket off. It can't be similar. It can't be just something that sits up on a poster on a wall that everyone says, oh, look how amazing we are because we have this commitment, because the populace of the consumers are too smart. There's too much information. And the speed of the consumer can break down brands very fast and say, your DEI commitment is nothing more than a press release or a byline in an article and an interview. But at the end of the day, you're not pulling through the execution, and you're not enlisting the populace to empower them to participate. You want to see real DE&I commitment? Watch companies that bring people of color into the product design phase. Let's take Louis Vuitton with Pharrell. You can see the urban nature of Louis Vuitton's brand being reshaped in its most recent fashion show, all the way down to the design level of its bag, because it speaks to more people of color versus the historical heritage. It speaks to a different population. We know who they are. So that's when you see it executed at its best, where they're like, yeah, you are multicultural, almost to the fact that you don't have to do multicultural marketing at all. You've created this law of attraction and desire that pulls people in, that people just want to participate and be part of the culture that you are cultivating. And that's a masterclass example of seeing done at its best. I think a lot of branches don't even understand what that means.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to gravitate there is that you mentioned this notion of minority-owned media, and this is another thing that I've seen a lot of in this narrative, in this dialogue around kind of this Venn diagram of multicultural and DE&I, is where does minority-owned media sort of sit in the narrative? What we've seen is that, again, a similar nature is multicultural targeting or multicultural media does not necessarily involve minority-owned media from an execution point of view. We found, though, on the other side of the equation, if you talk to a brand or an agency and you say, hey, look, we as a company are providing you with explicitly opted in data from Hispanics or African Americans to make sure that you're on board with privacy laws, we've often heard that brands at the higher level say, that's interesting, but our DE&I strategy is more aligned with making sure dollars are being allocated to minority media. To me, I feel like this is also kind of a bit of a miss, which is, I get it, the manifestation of the ad on the page on a minority-owned site, that makes lots of sense. But if you're doing that but not kind of targeting the individual downstream that has explicitly opted in, and we'll get to kind of like what is the privacy requirement around that, it just seems to me like it's another sort of broken link there, between, the disconnect between DE&I and multicultural, and then you have multicultural and the disconnect between minority-owned media, and then the disconnect between the explicitly opted in. I don't know, like, Mike, do you see this? Because you're seeing minority-owned publishers in your SSP and executions from individuals wanting to target multicultural. Are you seeing this type of breakdown? And I guess, how do you navigate that with the individual on the other end to make sure that they're checking the box, through the whole process?
Yeah, definitely. We're definitely seeing it. I think there's confusion around the difference between the two, right? Between DE&I and multicultural targeting. Hearing Albert speak, having this conversation right now, it really sounds like it's an education process. We need to educate buyers on the difference between the two. Need to get a better understanding of their goals, right? You will have conversations with buyers where they want to target specific groups, and that's a targeting conversation, right? And then if the agency, if the buyer has these DE&I goals, that can be completely different. And again, they're not mutually exclusive. I just think it's a matter of educating and having that open conversation about the goals, what they're trying to accomplish, because we see it at OpenX where, and I feel like it's an ad tech thing, right? You're having a conversation with someone, they're speaking to a project that they're working on, and you're taking it another way, right? So I think just being transparent with each other on what you're trying to accomplish is huge. Because from our side, right, like we can do both, right? Like we can layer on, targeting specific groups of people that a buyer might be after. Same thing with inventory. But Albert has called out, it's different when it's a DE&I objective here, and if a client or a buyer really wants to push money, which is more meaningful in putting actions behind their words with pushing budgets over to minority owned groups, that's another thing that we can facilitate. So again, I think it's just getting a better understanding of the goals there and then working with the buyer to accomplish those goals.
Yeah, I like what you said, Mike. And I think part of the important part here is that some of these companies didn't have their foundational commitment in order. So they were just kind of picking and choosing and doing it here. This all stems from one basic conversation, and that is investment needs to better match sales contribution. There are a lot of brands out there for which P&G is one of them. 60% of their sales contribution comes from a part of the populace that is non-white, but you can't invest 5%. So the base of D&I is like, you don't even have a real business commitment, right? This is not P&G, a lot of the other brands, to even begin to look at matching media investment with minority companies first as a starting point to get to a 60% parity conversation. So let's start there. Let's just make sure you're intentional about spending with minority businesses and giving them an opportunity, given what the populace is contributing to bottom line profitability. Then you can start to look at, okay, what's incremental reach in reaching minority segments beyond minority owned and operated properties as a build. You can almost look at multicultural in its own omni-channel conversation. Foundational layer, it's your, let's say it's your minority owned platforms. And then we look at general market mechanisms, even including programmatic, that can layer on top and give us exponential reach. But the problem is people are totally bypassing minority owned businesses as if they didn't build the media space. I mean, it was the beginning. You had to spin with a BET, a Univision, a Telemundo, a TV One in the start, because those are the only places we could find content to connect with ourselves. Granted, the marketplace has expanded and a lot of people are in the sandbox, but you at least have to give credit to who established it from the very beginning. It was Black radio stations that established the affinity for hip hop and R&B culture, etc. You can't just leave them for dead and not spin with them. And I think that was part of the narrative, is like, at least let's start there. No one's mad if we can't give you the exponential mass reach into 90% of the Black or Latino or Asian or queer populace, but to not do business with us at all or do it at a fractional marginalized level was just bad business practice from the beginning.
Yeah, there's a lot here. So I'm going to jump around so you guys can kind of cherry pick what you want to grab here. First, that notion about the P&G kind of comment around spend, the statistic, and this is approximate, so don't, kind of blow me up if it's, off by 5%, but, the notion is that, 5% of media spend is going to multicultural, but yet 40% of the US population identifies with some sort of minority group, which sort of, I think, is reinforcing that comment of like, 60% of the purchasing power is coming from a minority group, is 60% of your media dollars going there. There's no way. And so what I think is that it's so obvious to me, like, does it make sense? Well, one, how do we change that and obviously move it from 5, to be more representative 40? But on the flip side, I think the industry is in some ways maybe doing themselves a disservice here in closing the gap. I mean, the one thing that I always point to is we've seen an increasing number of platforms remove the ability to target ethnicity. And I get why, let's just use Facebook as an example. People have used the Fair Lending Act to market predatory products to minorities. And as a consequence for that, the platform said, okay, that's it. We're not going to allow you to market to any minority. So I guess what begs the question is that, okay, let's just use those round numbers. If 40% or 40% of the population or 60% of the media spend is what's happening in the market, and we want to increase the spend from 5% up, how do you do that when the platforms in the industry are eliminating the ability for you to use the deterministic data that sits inside of them to actually efficiently and ethically market to those groups? And isn't multicultural as a whole being almost a disservice by having that removed? So it's almost like, well, one group abused it, therefore we're going to remove the whole thing. And so, like, I'd like to talk a little bit about that and kind of knowing that tends to be the trend, and how do you get around that as a multicultural marketer or just somebody who is planning for the P&Gs of the world?
Yeah, it's funny, when I look at the Facebook snitch situation, for Facebook, that was one of those, they seemed as being complicit in how brands took advantage of, multicultural audiences. I mean, look, there are automotive brands who were selling higher interest rates to ethnic minorities, in particular Black, than other segments. That's you have to punish and go after those brands, not necessarily the marketplace that facilitated it. So some of the regulation to me was a bit of an overshot. It's like, look, at the end of the day, for political gain, people understand the manipulation of cultures and messages and narrative because what's at stake. That's nothing new. I think you have to regulate around verticals, around what isn't to be tolerated, what type of practice you can't put in place. And look, at the end of the day, you all upstream need to make sure you have fair practices in place once you meet the consumer, not put everything on the platform to do the brand's jobs. And that's what I think happens. Like, okay, Facebook got to do the brand of inside the Beltway. I'm in DC, so I can speak to that particular culture instead of going to all those factions saying none of those practices ever again. Same thing when you look at anyone who has a finance or product tied to it, whether it's insurance, it's banking, automotive, whether interest rates inside of that. You have to go regulate them and say, look, when you come into the digital space, these are things that just will not pass if you're going to participate on these major platforms to covet audiences. So it should have been kind of a one-to-one understanding and a more gentleman's agreement than Facebook is basically going to remove it. Because look, at the end of the day, the cultures identify with all these categories very, very differently. How the Black consumer versus Latino versus white American career looks at insurance is not uniform. It may be uniform when you get to the point of signing the policy, but the emotional triggers that make us inbound and draw affinity, not only to the category, but specific brands, is not monolithic. It's not even monolithic within cultures. Let's take the Latino culture and all the 20 plus countries of origin. They all look at these conversations very different. There are market conversations happening. They come from countries of origin and then come stateside that then evolve and become, and again, something else. So the inability to speak to the different value structures that are in a home handicaps a marketer to being more effective. So part of their investment spending is a bit of a dumpster fire because it's like lighting money on fire because it's not going to be effective. So that, you're right, Neil, that does an absolute disservice to the cultures in being properly marketed to, and to a point that maybe just adds more confusion, like, well, who are you speaking to with this product? Because you don't really seem to culture align with our value system or level of acculturation understanding in this country. So I don't know if I can make a informed business decision. And these are things that to me haven't been revisited, because some of these decisions are about keeping Capitol Hill off your back. If we just whitewash all this and move that, then we don't get phone calls anymore. We don't have to spend any more money in lobbying. And now, that's not the answer either, because now with the advent of AI, we're about to go accelerate back to this notion of intimacy, whether the walled gardens participate in that conversation or not. The external factors and platforms will now find a way in to better identify. So then now what? And I think that's the thing that wasn't revisited, that the speed of consumers accelerating, data is becoming more intimate, and a marketer is trying to chase that down. Why I think technology is moving. So these provisions don't really help move the market conversation. They just create blind spots for which technology just finds a workaround. And I don't, it's, what does that mean when you start to plan forward for the future?
And to add to that, really, I think the theme there with what Albert said is transparency and collaboration, right? Like, it shouldn't be just on one company within the ecosystem to make sure that everyone is doing what they're saying they're doing, right? I think, we all know how complex programmatic is. There are a bunch of different partners involved to serve and add to someone programmatically, whether it's the DSP, SSP, the buyer themselves, the creative. I think everyone has a responsibility in that chain to make sure that they are not only saying what they're doing, what they're saying they're doing, but also being transparent, right? I think transparency is a word that is tossed around a lot. And as a result of that, it's watered down, but it is important that everyone is being transparent, not only in their methodology and their targeting, but their end goals, right? You want to make sure that people are being safe and ethical when doing this type of targeting.
Let's talk about privacy here, because I think that there is a massive intersection here between multicultural DEI and privacy. And you two are well versed in my kind of frustrations around, I'd say, like, the general industry's understanding of privacy. To me, what I find baffling is the level of understanding as it relates to privacy, as it is impacting the day-to-day job of people that we're speaking to in the industry. You would be shocked at how many brands, agencies, senior level executives that we talk to who have very little understanding as to what is happening state by state, very little understanding of what constitutes sensitive personal information, or SPI, and where that intersection is around privacy, SPI, and how it is affecting, their day-to-day. not to be provocative, I'm of the opinion that almost every Fortune 500 brand today is running an illegal multicultural campaign in the United States today, for sure. Why? Because I don't know one brand or one platform that is removing specific states or individuals in states that have not explicitly opted in. And, if you start to look at these numbers, let's just kind of quickly riff through this. Since, the beginning of 23, we've had over 10 states introduce new privacy legislation. There's about 70 million people in the United States sitting within those individual states that require an explicit, not an assumed opt-in in order to be marketed to. I suspect everybody that is listening to this or watching this, how many of those people are identifying that these are the individual states that you actually need to have a physical opt-in to speak to a Hispanic?
Yep.
The answer is none. Like, there's no chance. And then on top of it, if you take all of those that have a requirement to at least alert the consumer that they're collecting this information, the number goes from 60 to over 110. And then if you take those additional states that have legislation in place but has not yet been approved, the number is close to 170 to 180 million people. So back to my point, around this notion of, if you are a Fortune 500 brand today and you are running multicultural and you are running on data that is not opted in at least those specific states, you're offside of the law and you are going to receive action from one of those attorney generals. I literally don't think one brand or agency is aware of that type of risk. But I don't know, obviously, Albert, you see that, you talk to a lot of brands, you're in that community. Mike, you talk to a lot of publishers and a lot of agencies. Like, what's your vantage point? Like, do you think that people understand the complexity of this or sort of their exposure to this? Because I don't.
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I did a presentation at Ad Monsters Data and Privacy Summit in Miami earlier this year. And literally my presentation was just that. First of all, you have to understand most people in the room were heads of sales, heads of content. They weren't lawyers and general counsel in the room. And I told the audience, I said, look, if I was going to make my first million, if I had a law degree, I'd send you all a letter today, and we're just going to settle out of court. And I said, we settle out of court, 50,000 a pop, I'll get my first million. Because you have no grounds to argue with me in front of an attorney general. And I remember one of the slides I put up was literally how the 5 states are looking at, this particular legislation that you just referenced, and then California. And I said, they're all looking at you like, and I had Kevin Hart memes, they're looking at you like, really? You still doing this? And then I was like, in California, they're having a party because they're about to start raking in, some legislative federal money just based on the pervasiveness of the abuse. The problem is the people who are brokering the relationships, they're not bringing legal and general counsel to the conferences, to the speeches, to the meetings to assess risk. I mean, look, the average buyer is in, look, I know Michael probably knows this, looking at essentially all the agencies deal with, everybody's a risk manager, whether they're a brand or they're an agency. That's what they're doing. They're trying to mitigate risk in the buying, but they're not bringing the real risk managers into the conversation to understand how they're skirting the law and sort of playing with fire. And as I told the audience, like, you're all on borrowed time. You're just borrowing it. They gave you extended minutes. The game was over at 90 minutes, but they give you an extra second 7 minutes playing time to see if you're going to tie it up. Maybe you win, who knows? And then it'll extend the time. I said you're fortunate because the marketplace is signaling that you have more leeway than you really do. And I shared the Oracle example. Neil and I talked about it. I shared Sephora, and Sephora is interesting because Sephora's interpretation was that they weren't skirting the law based upon how they looked at the uses of data. But obviously the attorney general found them incorrect. And then obviously you saw the massive Epic Games lawsuit, $500 million. And I told everybody in the room, I said, $500 million. I said, none of you all salaries worth $500 million. And most of you companies profit, like net sales is not $500 million, but that's what they're owed to pay. I said, you need to think about the implications of that. Obviously the room was pretty quiet. I don't think anybody wanted to talk to me after my presentation, but it's the truth. And when you look at culture and the level of sensitivity around the misuse of information, that was, nothing could have been more prominent than COVID and the lack of distrust, in particular the Black community, with pharma's data and information, or just the healthcare sector, with the lack of adoption of wanting to get vaccinated. That tells you what the cultures think about usage of information and how it's been prostituted historically. Those are real signals about problems that are coming. And that's why this conversation has to get like some real currency behind it. Because what's the fallout? It could be massive if segments felt that brands were misusing information to trick them into buying their product. It would be, you wouldn't be able to recover. It's bad enough when brands say, hey, we didn't really make product for the Black consumer the way, Timberland did and some of the other European brands that you can only find in an outlet mall now. But those brands had massive fallouts in overall P&L. But misuses of data, it becomes unexcusable. It's one thing if you didn't make it for us. It's another thing if you're actually misusing information against us.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this multiple times that there's this fixation on the cookie narrative, and I've often said it's the most dangerous conversation in ad tech, and people always kind of brush it off. I'm like, I think first people think privacy and the cookie are one and the same, and that as long as the cookie's around, that privacy is not going to come into effect. But like what they're missing is the forest from the trees here, and they're not realizing that the whole narrative of the cookie as it continues to get pushed out. What they're forgetting is that more and more states are kind of driving this legislation. And so if people have that opinion that, oh, I'm just going to kind of continue to follow along with the rest of the market, they're just expanding the exposure that they have to the brand that they're representing. Absolutely. And there's a massive disconnect there. And what I think this fixation on the cookie is often like, the whole conversation on the cookie is due to changes in privacy, but like privacy is a lot larger than the cookie. You've seen reduction in signals all over the place.
Yep.
Changes in legislation. I think people are so focused on small aspects as it relates to privacy that they're missing kind of the bigger stuff. And the bigger stuff, as you mentioned, is like, multicultural, or as it relates to SPI, or that sensitive personal information, ethnicity, sexuality, location, financial data. This is all stuff that kind of falls under that SPI category. So if you're a brand and you're actually targeting these types of individuals, using that data with suppliers and others that you've worked with in 2022 when the law was in a different form, all you're doing is sort of exposing that. And so like, are those brands, are those agencies sort of taking a harder look at like, hey, like this is 2023, we've got to be thinking differently about these brands. Like, I don't know, like Mike, how did you guys think about this in OpenX as things continue to evolve? Like, how did that change or manifest internally as you guys started thinking about execution and data and working with different clients?
Yeah, it's complex and it's ever changing, right? I don't think this is a project that you can work on, finish it, and then set it aside. I think it's an ongoing task as long as you're doing business, right? And I think in terms of the general market's understanding of privacy and how they approach it, given our position in the marketplace as an SSP, we work with a lot of different partners, from tech companies to publishers to agencies. And from what I can tell, everyone has a different stake and approach to privacy. So it involves collaboration and making sure everyone is in line and making sure that they're doing what they're saying they're doing. But for us at OpenX, it's really keeping our ear to the ground and making sure that we're on it and keeping with the time. So we have a head of privacy internally to make sure that everything that we're doing is compliant and transparent. And again, going back to education, there are times where we will sit down with a partner to get an understanding of their offering, but also educate them on what they're doing to see if there's a way to collaborate to make sure both companies are doing the right thing.
Mike, I'm curious. I mean, in my days of the buying side, I've always been very hyper vigilant and diligent with our partners, and some of them, granted, they're merged companies now between Trimmer, Moby, Demand Local, Capify. I've always been in their supply conversation as Mobile. Like, I've literally asked, what are you buying? I've even had partners switch the supply, and I'm like, I don't like that supply. It's not performing well. Reset it to where we were 3 months ago. And then look, they did it. And they did it because they respected that I was very hands-on and involved in ensuring their outcomes of success. And, I would always tell partners, like, it's not an option for you to fail. I don't want to go to a client and say, you failed for me. We both look stupid. I need you to win. So I'm going to help you set up the win. I mean, and so beyond when you get to quality of data, provisions around it, audiences, where you're sourcing it, et cetera, I'm looking all the way down the pipes, down to the end of the line. And part of it is the marketer in me. I'm more supply chain minded. So I'm like, where is it all coming from? What's the genesis? What's the origin? Let's start there and work our way back. Because we nail that, everything on the front end would take care of itself. I used to use this notion that, machines are only as good as the people informing them. The machines themselves don't have cultural intelligence. You need people who do. And I'm curious, in your experience, have you seen the level of diligence, whether you're dealing with brand director from agencies who seem to give it, is really being understanding the sauce that you are making, so it's pulled all the way through? Because look, they represent the brand. They should know the brand better than the platforms. And it seems that the platforms are now having to be the brand ambassadors for everybody, because there's not enough thinking coming across. So I'm curious if you can talk to what your experience has been, and maybe your POV on what's missing it at scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think when talking to the buy side, it's different levels of understanding, right? So, you have some partners that totally get it, and therefore you're kind of working together, being transparent and making sure that we are delivering what they're looking for. There are other partners that we work with in the space that will admit that they may not be up to speed on all the regulations and laws coming to market, and therefore it's an education game where we're acting more as a consultant rather than a tech company to bring them up to speed on A, what it is, and B, what we're doing about it. And on that point, for us, it's, again, collaboration and working with our partners. So whether it's working with a data company that might have segments related to ethnicity, or other demographics, it's working with them to make sure that their methodologies are compliant and that they're transparent in terms of they're doing what they're saying that they're doing there. Same thing with the publisher part, right? Like going back to the DEI topic, right? Like if someone is saying that they are a minority-owned group, we want to make sure that they are indeed a minority-owned publisher or company. And so it's working with those publishers to get a better understanding of their company, their workflows, and validating that so we can bring a more comprehensive offering to market.
Let's take on that for just a second, because I like the publisher conversation. To what degree do you see people doing what's right versus doing what's monetizable? Because I think that's a big part of this conversation, Neil, is that the fact is, like, they want to do good, but they're like, but are we going to make money off it and say margin? And if not, what's the incentive? So that chicken and egg, they didn't really get there. So I'm curious from you in terms of like what you feel the market, like how they leading, and perhaps that's the basis of why they haven't quite gotten it right.
Yeah, I mean, Albert, when you said the similarity to like greenwashing, right? I think that's, maybe we can come up with another term here on this webinar for this topic, right? I think that's a concern, and that's real. I don't have a percentage of who's saying it but not doing it, right? I just think it's something that we are tracking and monitoring, right? And again, going back to what I said a few seconds ago, it's an ongoing effort, right? In terms of reaching out to our partners, learning more about them, but also there's the validation piece, and then staying on top of it, right? Because companies change, companies evolve, and you want to make sure that you're current. Yeah, I don't have you if you have any other takes on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the programmatic industry, first of all, is plagued with issues regarding transparency to start with, right? So that, like, forget about SPI, multicultural, DEI. Programmatic struggles with transparency on a good day. It's the amount of people, and I think even if you refer back to, the information that was coming out of ANA last week regarding the amount of spend that was being lost, primarily due to chasing cheap media, I think that in one sense answers a lot of the question that kind of Albert said, like, if holistically people are chasing cheap media, which is leading to billions of dollars in loss, I mean, that is going to exacerbate kind of in the future. The other comment, that, you made, Albert, that I think is valid, and I think it sort of speaks to sort of where the industry is going, and I think the industry is in for a rude awakening as it relates to this, is that idea of being able to see through the value chain. So you have an individual whose data is manifesting in an audience, which is then transacting through a pipe onto a page. The ability to see through that value chain is nearly impossible today because of all the various different hops. What we call that is fair trade. So we're all familiar with the notion of like fair trade coffee. You're going farm to table. Everyone is being kind of compensated and, you know, participating. This notion of like fair trade media or fair trade data, you know, is non-existent, you know, in a lot of ways in this industry, because you don't have any visibility on, you know, the individual that's powering that audience segment, and you often don't have visibility on the media as to where it's sort of manifesting. What I think, and this, you know, to just answer kind of one of the questions that's in the thread here from Will, where he's, you know, he's asking about transparency of minority customers' data being priced lower. You know, to me, when you're looking for a physical opt-in, or you have to have a physical opt-in, that intuitively means it's going to be more expensive, like flat out, right? So I actually think that when you look at the data market today, or even the media market, it's inherently been commoditized because of programmatic. Now, SPO and private marketplace deals and all those types of things have helped kind of improve that. But, you know, we've seen a lot of commoditization here. The issue, though, is that when you actually say put the consumer, you know, involved in it, whether that's through a physical opt-in or through a payment rail like we have here, you're inherently going to see an increase in the cost of data, which is going to manifest in the cost of your media, which if the psyche of the buyer does not change to align, your issue with fraud is going to get compounded, because you're still going to be chasing cheap data, cheap media, when in fact, the market's kind of going the other way. And, you know, I just think that people are trying to run businesses and they're operating on margin. I don't think people are putting into their models the explosive cost of data in the future. That's my personal opinion. And I think it's even exacerbated more when you get into specialty data like healthcare data or financial data or multicultural data, that which requires, you know, active participation from a user. That's going to be really, really tricky. And I think it doesn't necessarily align with the business models of a lot of the businesses that are kind of powering this industry right now.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, if you do direct mail, you understand that every select you layer on, it gets more expensive. It's greater precision. I used to tell people it's more expensive to target surgeons than general practitioners. There are way more general practitioners than surgeons, duh. Same thing with HIV versus allergies. A lot of people are sniffing this time of the year. Not many HIV hand raisers just walk around the US public. HIV is very expensive to target. It's the same thing with degree of precision, in particular multicultural. There are less Black and Latinos in this country than the 350 million, so they cost more. And I remember speaking at a Prague IO summit last year, and I'm like, look, there's no such thing as a $5 CPM Black consumer on the internet. It's 20, because it's a segment within a segment. Basic segmentation is more layering, cost goes up. As you said, because data goes up, the cost to acquire goes up, CPM goes up. It's a lie that programmatic in some of the constituents of business have been telling the marketplace that we can find cheap multicultural inventory. No, what you can do is find people on gossip sites, humor sites, Candy Crush. I don't have anything against those platforms, but if you're a premium brand, your consumer profile does not match to those environments. This is common sense. People are it's just a lie to say that, oh, you can reach them very efficiently and cheap. No, all segmentation costs more, and the more greater premium you put on understanding inherently who they are, and the degree of precision drives up the cost. But let's be clear, with some of these brands selling, you know, a $2,000 to $50,000 product, what difference does a $5 versus $20 CPM really make? At the end of the day, there's a finite number of people operating at all times who have real intent for what you're selling. The other people don't care, don't want it, can't afford it. So this cheap inventory, 3 billion impressions is a false number. It's a false positive at the highest level. At the end of the day, every marketer knows how much product they sell because it's in shipping manifest. They call it supply chain management. And they know what a growth number is. They tell their brand managers, we need to make 5, 10%, 2%, 10%, 20% a year. Well, if you take the percentage of sales volume, that's your customer number, period. It's not 3 billion. Most brands can't even support a 3x manufacturing increase. They can't do it because they can't even buy the supplies to actually triple production. So this idea that you can find all these mass aid people for which don't really exist as a consumer, for which supply could not even match if it was real anyway, all makes it it's like, it couldn't be the most unreal conversation. As they say, it's just anti-true. And it's like people need to get to reality and understand what's the real number that you're chasing that gets into a realizable actual cost for which the data and the CPM of that audience is really worth.
Yeah.
But no, I was also going to say, every campaign has a number to hit, whether it's a CPA or ROI, but also, are there secondary goals that the marketer might have, right? Including more minority groups in their buy, even if it costs more, right? And I think that's another conversation buyers and sellers need to have, right? You obviously, again, want to hit your business objectives, but if it comes at a higher price, is everyone okay with that? Because I think I can hear, Albert, I can hear every seller, in market right now screaming that, yes, I want to do the right thing. It's more expensive, but I want to keep doing it. But I have a buyer that has a CPA goal that I have to hit. Sometimes those two things don't run together.
Well, here's the thing. I don't disagree with that. Here's the thing. It's kind of like clinical trials. Clinical trials in this country was largely based on white males. Well, if you look at the population of healthcare and pharma who they're chasing people of color largely. So because the population has shifted. Well, if you don't have data on the other 40% of the audience you're trying to pursue, will they really swallow the pill? And it's the same thing. The model was developed for one individual that now it cannot be extrapolated and applied to a series of new dynamics. So it's the same thing as pricing model. Okay, you have a $5 CPM goal. That's based on general market, 359 million. I get it. The reality is the population you're pursuing that's Black is what, 39 million? That's very different from 350 million. The economics don't match. And then if you look at the consumer with them that actually qualify or essentially have intent for you, maybe that's 2 million. That's a totally different price structure. You can't put that on a $5 CPM. Doesn't work. It's the same thing if you've been pursuing white America. So say white America is 200 million of the US populace. Well, if you go after Latinos and they're 79 million, I don't know what the actual number is, probably larger now, you can't apply the same math. This is the problem, but you wouldn't do that in supply chain marketing where you're sitting there saying, this car, this vehicle, we're only going to sell 3,000 units because it costs 150 grand. But this one, we're going to sell 5 million units because it only costs 20,000. You can't apply the model for a $20,000 car to a $150,000 car. No one does that in business. I'm trying to understand the programmatic business, why people are doing that. And it defies all business common sense. You just can't do it. So it's not true to try to apply a general market narrative to segmentation models. It doesn't work. It was never going to work. And that's where I think people just aren't educated. And the problem is they've sold brands on this bill of goods, and now they're too afraid to walk it back, but they don't feel like they can walk it back. So they're trying to continue to overpromise an engineering machine that's never going to produce the output because it only got away with it in the early stages. It won't in perpetuity. And programmatic is just like it's going to be able to do it to infamy, and it's not. And the AI algorithms that are now going to crunch audience representation are going to make it clear. We have deep learning on the consumer now. It is not $2 CPM deep learning. These powerful machines are a $30 CPM. But guess what? We've now mitigated 80% of your marketing waste. So you don't have to even spend as much money to hit the same numbers. That is what is coming. So if programmatic doesn't wake that up, you're going to have an AI-driven DSP world topple over this efficiency DSP world that was giving false hope and false numbers anyway.
Yeah, for sure. So we're getting close to time here. So I just encourage anybody as an attendee who has any questions that they want to ask the group here, fire away. Maybe just as some sort of closing thoughts and ideas, let's try to give a couple of takeaways to people here, based on experience and history in the space. So, for those that are watching, maybe Mike, I'll start with you, or if you're not ready, you can pass it to Albert. But do you have what are a couple of tips for those people who are looking, who have a multicultural brand or a multicultural tactic, or trying to satisfy a DEI goal? What in your opinion is sort of best practice from yours / OpenX's kind of point of view? And then maybe Albert, pass to you, and then I'll finish up, and then we'll close it off.
Yeah, I mean, my recommendation would be to ask questions, right? I think a big theme of this whole conversation was transparency, collaboration, and education, right? So if you have a multicultural campaign, DE&I initiatives, ask questions to the vendors that you're working with. What are they doing in this space? How can you two collaborate to achieve those objectives? You know, from our side, it's making sure our data partners are being transparent with us, safe and ethical in terms of their methodologies and how they're collecting the data and how users are permissioning them to use that data from the pub side. It's making sure that we get a better understanding of who the publisher is and validating it all. So again, I think it just goes back to the collaboration and just making sure that the two parties are in line, both in terms of objectives and goals, but also in terms of methodologies that they're going to implement for their campaign.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, I think, because, Walton Isaacson is a culture first agency. I think one of the original founding principles or taglines that Aaron Walt came up with was face the world the way it faces you. Like, I think the programmatic sector has to get smarter. That's why I always say that programmatic is not a cultural intelligence center. It very much has a machine, but you need people who are thinking, as Michael said, ask the questions, get behind the machine and understand its inner working. I mean, look, I give OpenX credit because you helped build the space. From the early days of looking at what an app nexus and a data zoo did, and all of a sudden those brands are gone. But the people who help build these, like, they're smart. They know what they're talking about. They can get you to the it. I think foundationally, you got to stand for something. So this is why you need DE&I principles beyond the is it do good. You just need to have it established so you have a place to play. There's nothing wrong with scaling beyond or having to play with precision. Because the biggest thing that I see in the marketplace, does publisher content, do their platforms, or the consumption of their content, this is CTV, TV, all that, have direct correlation to purchase of that consumer marketer's product? And oftentimes, maybe not so much, but I think there are platforms that can help you make the connection with deeper understanding, and particularly when you get from a multicultural standpoint. But when you get into the multicultural marketing aspect, you need to look at the idea of investment matching contribution of sales. If it doesn't, you will not be rewarded into infamy. And there's a competitor who is paying attention, who will realize you're backsliding and falling short on the commitment versus the opportunity. They will come in and fill in the gap where you are not investing to steal momentum, because they realize there's affinity for products in a category, in a class. And if they fit in that class and they see that you're underinvesting, like, oh, we can take who you aren't serious about. And that's basically what brands are doing in these hyper competitive markets. In particular, that consumers are always shopping. We're always shopping. We're always evaluating what else is out there in every category all day long, in particular since COVID. So that behavior means that we're always evaluating our next. Everyone is in the cultures, because of how they feel like bias has been against them, are even more vigilant at looking at, should I be rocking with this brand, and who's a better brand for the future conversation? And if so, going to make it hard out, that's who I'll be buying. Consumers are very smart and they're moving very fast. And I think the sector needs to get off this, and start to pick up a little bit of pace and close the gap there.
Yeah, and I would say, in closing, a couple of things. One is, it's literally the fastest growing opportunity. It's the fastest growing segment. So in, your comment around, programmatic wasn't a machine built to deal with sort of these nuances, right? It was meant to drive efficiency and operational rigor. But knowing that there's this disparity in multicultural marketing, if you are looking to make a dent, for your brand and make a difference for your brand, reducing this disparity between the 5% of media spent versus the 40% representation, like, that's the low hanging fruit. And that's, to me, is where every car manufacturer, CPG brand, et cetera, should be participating. A couple of comments for me that I would suggest to anybody here that is looking at multicultural marketing or DE&I is, first and foremost is, we are inundated with sort of these newsletters around kind of privacy legislation. No one reads that. Like, we all know it, like Oregon, Texas, California, CPRA, like we're inundated with it. I would tell every marketer that the one metric that you should follow is the opt-in metric. That is the one. Forget about, line 57 or paragraph 24. You should know what data variables require an opt-in and in what states. And if you follow that and use that as the foundation for a lot of your DE&I or multicultural marketing, you are going to be in the top 1% of marketers on the planet, like, for sure. So know what that is. And, like, there's tons of resources that are there for that. I would say that's the biggest one. Execution wise, just as a sort of a tactical point, where I think what we've seen some success with in the past is that, one, knowing that you need to have an opt-in audience, as it relates to multicultural marketing, taking that opted-in audience and then pairing it with minority-owned media in the form of a PMP or a deal, you're able to satisfy an enormous amount of your goals in one kind of execution. You're solving transparency, you're solving premium, you're solving DEI, you're solving multicultural. I would encourage people to talk to the various different panelists on here about that type of execution. The last thing I'll just say, and then this was sort of thrown up in a thread here as one of the questions, is sort of the movement towards a national privacy law. That too is one of the biggest distractions that I'd say is happening in the market, and it's often kind of being thrown around by too many of the lawyers that work in our organizations. You don't need a national privacy legislation. You already have it, because if California has it, that's going to drive everything that you have, right? So, because there's, anywhere from 10 to 13 states implementing, this law. I learned this from, one of the senior people at Google. It's like, look, you're not gonna try to conform with every state law. What you're going to do is you're going to benchmark against the most onerous law in the country and let everything else fall underneath it. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. Yes, eventually you might get to that, but I think this narrative around kind of waiting for a national kind of privacy law, if that's what you're waiting for to kind of drive privacy and drive privacy and and activation, I think you're just falling further and further behind. So that's my personal opinion as it relates to the national privacy law. I'm like, forget it. Like, there's too much bureaucracy involved in that. Follow sort of the states that are implementing the opt-in. If you're putting that at the foundations of your campaign, you're going to be in the top 1%. Okay, so we got 1 minute here. So let's just do one quick thing. Albert, thanks so much for joining us. Where can if people want to find you or follow you, I would encourage everybody to follow Albert. He's like a social influencer. He's got more stuff going on from Cannes last week, making me feel like I was actually there. Where can they find you or reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just find me on LinkedIn. You'll see my profile with some sunglasses on. Look, I just put the picture up so it's memorable and easy to find. It might be the first one that comes out. So definitely ping me there. The other thing is, I've always kept a podcast on, it's syndicated on Spotify. It's called The Transient Identity. And look, it chronicles all this stuff, chasing the consumer. So look, it's all snackable, short excerpts, clips, just to kind of stay informed, because it's a lot to break down. But yeah, an absolute pleasure to be on, Neil.
Awesome, thanks. And Mike, where can people find you if they want to reach out for a little bit more information?
Yeah, I'm not entertaining on the social channels, but I am on LinkedIn, which my wife told me this morning I should change my photo because I don't have the beard in it. But you can find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to ping me with any questions. Would love to connect.
Yeah, and again, for me, if you want to reach out to me, you can reach me at neil@reclaimyours.com or on LinkedIn as well. And so just thanks everybody for carving out some time in your day. I know everyone's busy. If you had to leave early or you want a full copy of this, we will be sending it out. Probably not next week, because I don't think anybody's actually in the office in the United States next week, but it will be on our website. We will be sending it out. Mike, Albert, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate you. Appreciate the time. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely.